Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Koepp, a journalist and co-founder of From Day One. In today's webinar, we'll be exploring a topic that's everlasting, but has taken on special urgency this year. We're talking about building an anti-racist culture in the business community. Even before the pandemic struck, the gaps between white and Black America in health, wealth, and justice were already vast. Now the issue is more urgent than ever. How can the influence and resources of corporate America be wielded to fight systemic racism? What can employers do to provide jobs, career development, working parent support, and community investment? And how can we be sure we're using well-informed and thoughtful language to talk about these issues? Before we dive into this topic, we'd like to thank our partners McKinsey and Company and Achievers. I'll tell you a little about them. McKinsey and Company is a global management consulting firm committed to helping organizations create change that matters. McKinsey's COVID Response Center is a way for the company to support and amplify the many ongoing and urgent efforts that aim to first safeguard lives and then livelihoods, while helping communities that are dealing with the fallout of the global pandemic. Achievers' employee voice and recognition solutions bring your organization's values and strategy to life, activate employee participation, and fuel a culture of performance to experience data-driven business results. Now, a few logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. Within about 24 hours of the event, you'll be getting an email with the link. That email will also have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from the Society of Human Resource Management. And look out for a written account of the conversation soon on our website at fromday1.co. At about 3 p.m., we'll have a Q&A session with you, the audience. You can submit your questions anytime using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Erica Licht, who is Senior Fellow at the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, the IARA, at Harvard University, and has been engaged in racial equity and organizational change research and training for more than 15 years. Erica is a Fulbright Scholar and has worked nationally and globally in collaboration with community and organizational leaders to build practices of equity, including in New York City, Addis Ababa, and Sao Paulo. In addition to her research and training, Erica also co-hosts the podcast called Untying Knots. We're delighted to have her lead this conversation with our distinguished speakers, who you'll meet presently. Okay, Erica, over to you.
Great, thanks, Steve, and really happy to be here with everyone this afternoon. Thanks From Day One for having us. This conversation is really a critical one, and the themes of working to establish an anti-racist organizational culture and also just a society that is equitable and rooted in real practices of equity is a crucial one. And so I'm really excited to dive into these themes in a moment with our panelists of how we make this work sustainable and accountable. And I'm also reminded of the Dr. King quote and his words of our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And this statement is true, both because I'm sitting in chilly Boston right now as fall is actively approaching, as is winter, but also a critical time, where we are coming in the wake of a summer filled with uprising, greatly publicized in the media. And it's our work really to think about how we continue to advance anti-racism as we head into the fall and winter. So this work is multi-generational, it's longitudinal, and we're gonna do some of that analysis together today on what it really means to do this work. So I'm joined by Kendra Goldbas, who's the Director of Professional Development for the McKinsey West Coast offices. Kendra has oversight and responsibility for professional development, project staffing, performance management, among many other components of the work across 5 firm locations. And prior to joining McKinsey, she was Associate Director for the University of Pennsylvania Institute for Urban Research. She holds degrees from the Harvard Kennedy School, connection which we share, and is a member of the Links Inc. and serves on the University of Washington Dean's Council for the School of Public Health. I encourage you to read about her and all of our panelists also in more detail on this event page. Bobby Griffin is the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for CBRE, the world's largest commercial real estate services company with over 100,000 employees in over 100 countries. In his role, he works closely with the Chief Diversity Officer and the leadership team. And prior to joining CBRE, Bobby was the head of he was the global head of diversity inclusion for Flowserve Corporation. He's also held various regional and national level roles amongst several Fortune 100 companies. Rhonda Vonshay Sharpe is the founder and president of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. Her research focuses on gender and racial inequality, diversity in STEM, and demography of higher education. She served on the faculty at Barnard, Bennett College, Bucknell, Columbia, Duke, is clearly an esteemed scholar across many universities, and is the co-editor of the Review of Black Political Economy. She's also served as the president of the National Economic Association. I am really delighted to be in conversation with three incredible leaders today and to really get to hear, from each of your distinct professional perspectives where this work is going and where it is right now. So we'll start with that question. From where you sit in both your professional roles and affiliations, what is most present for you right now in this work to build anti-racism as an organizational culture and core value? And I'll go ahead and start with you, Kendra.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. It's really exciting to be with this group of folks, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. From where I sit, which is in the space of really talent development and professional growth, I really think about it in three ways. I think about it as the work we need to do around building knowledge, skills, and then really creating space for engagement. What I think we've seen over the course of this past year in particular, right, is this notion of self-awareness, right, that comes from the environment we're in and what it really means to sort of address these topics. And so that sense of knowledge of the environment that we're facing, what it means to us personally, right? I think there's been a lot of personal reflection and growth that you've seen amongst probably personal communities as well as professional ones. And definitely that has been the case for us here at McKinsey. And so that first step of really acknowledging the space that we're in and where you sit in it. But the second piece in my mind is really about skill building, right? So when you talk about racism, when you talk about it wanting to identify with an anti-racist culture, you really have to have the skills to engage, right, in the work as you call it, and in the conversation, and really to sort of grow yourself and grow your community and your colleagues around you. So that's something that we actually have spent a lot of time really thinking about and trying to provide platforms for our communities and our colleagues around, right? So how do we make the notion of skill building around inclusion, around language of diversity, right, a part of really the experience at McKinsey from day one, but then in an ongoing way, right? Because the notion of, I think that concept of, well, I'm going to take a diversity training course and then I'm cured, right? And everyone around me is cured. I think we know is just, it's unrealistic, and it really isn't about getting to the deeper issues that matter to us all. And then the third piece I would add to that is this notion of engagement. And that's something, I'm very invested in. I think, we as a community and as a group of colleagues are very invested in how do we engage one another, right? So we've got some skill building, but how do we actually engage one another to dialogue, to take action, frankly, to be vulnerable, right? A huge part of when you think about the notion of building this kind of culture is you have to, be acknowledging of your own space, of your own frailty, right? Of the things you want to see and that you don't, of the experiences you've had, on and on, right? So you've got to create space for engagement. You've got to create space for allies. You've got to create space, right, for those folks who can express the experiences that they've had. So those three elements to me, and we can, I'm sure dive into a lot of others, but that sense of real acknowledgement of knowledge, building of skills, and space for engagement are, to me, the foundations and the building blocks of where you get started.
Thank you. It's a great start of some of themes that we'll definitely draw more on. I'll send it over to Bobby and then Rhonda.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, and I definitely agree with the great points that Kendra made, and for us from an organizational standpoint, we have to look at the issue across all the areas that impact our business, and that is, our culture, our talent, and marketplace. And our culture, is our work environment. Are we creating work environments that are conducive to enhancing inclusion and to addressing challenges around discrimination, around racism, optimizing the diverse talent pools, and from an internal and an external standpoint, are we sourcing and bringing diverse talent into the organization so that they can thrive in those environments that we seek to enhance and make more inclusive, and from a marketplace standpoint, a marketplace that involves customer, suppliers, the communities in which we work. Are we really engaging in a way in each of those areas to enhance our relationships with diverse customers, and to enhance our relationships with the various diverse communities in which we reside? And that's an ongoing effort. Many organizations try to show up at the last moment, and we're saying, building diverse relationships and addressing discrimination, addressing racism in the community is more like being in a relationship than speed dating. And many organizations try to speed date, in that they show up at the last minute and want all this return on investment, but you really have to build that relationship over time. And when we look at the current situation, and with the racial injustice, societal unrest, the conversations we've had as leadership is looking at that from an acute and a chronic aspect of it. Yeah, there are some current acute aspects that are going on, and things that organizations need to do to take a stand and take a position and not be on the sidelines as it relates to discrimination, racism, diversity, all these things that have come up most recently. But we also understand that there's a chronic aspect of this as well. And so we have to look at, how do we enhance our impact on our employees, in our communities over the long term, and in this chronic aspect of that. And the way we're looking to do that, and what we're doing now, is seeking to increase what we call our visibility, our capability, and our accountability. Visibility: are we enhancing our leaders' awareness of where the true opportunities are from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, from a discrimination standpoint, and what are some of the root causes around that? Are we helping them to be more aware of that visibility and see those? Then once we do that, are we building their capability to do something about it? It's not enough to be aware and see it, or what do you do about it? And so are we enhancing them, providing them tools and resources, and enhance our leadership's capability to address those opportunities? And finally, from an accountability standpoint, anything that any organization feels that is important, they're going to make it visible, they're going to measure it, and they're going to hold people accountable for it. If you don't do that, then it turns out it's just talk. That sounds good when you say it, looks great on websites, but are you actually holding yourselves as an organization and the leaders accountable? So that visibility, capability, accountability. So that's the approach that we're taking to address it.
Yeah, the chronic would be more accurate, right, in our analysis, as I've said, in thinking about both the short and long-term goals. Rhonda, I believe people are wishing you bless you as you were sneezing just now, so I want to extend that, and love to hear from you, both from the research you've been involved in as well as the Institute.
And thank you. And Tisha Campbell sent me a bless you directly. So thank you. I was hoping that they weren't seeing me do that. Hopefully I'll get through this without actually sneezing. So at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, so first I want to start by saying why we exist. And that is, as I always tease people, and I say, when I was turning 50, and they say when you're feisty 50, you're like, no more, I'm done, I'm not taking any more stuff off of folks. But what I was beginning to recognize more and more was that the work on women weren't talking about me, right? And if they were talking about Black and Hispanic women, we were between the commas, and it was deficit based. Or there would be a paragraph about Black and Hispanic women, and again, it was deficit based. So that is, we exist to make women-focused research more inclusive. So our mission is that women's focused research will include the needs of Asian, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and multiracial women. So I start from the standpoint of language, the language that we talk about with respect to inclusion. Things like not using terms like women of color unless you've actually defined the women that you're talking about, because there is so much erasure in the term women of color, right? So, if you're talking about me, you don't call me a woman of color, right? I'm a Black woman or an African-American woman. To erase that, to me, it's not inclusive. So I start first with the thought of language, which is something that Kendra talked about, this language around diversity and inclusion. And the next for me is when we see things like women and minorities. I always ask, well, who are the women? Because again, as a Black, Kendra, don't laugh at me, right? Because I mean, it's serious, right? Like, we ask this question, who are the women? And inevitably the women you're talking about are white women. So why don't you put the descriptor in front of that says white women and minorities? And so I think that as we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we don't stop to think that it's terms like that will make a woman like me ask, ain't I still a woman? And I spoke about this to some middle schoolers, and I was so surprised that this young white male who was probably in the 6th grade, I didn't even get to that part. He was like, oh, like Sojourner Truth, ain't I still a woman? I had to look like, wait, what? Exactly, right? So for me, a lot of it is about language, making sure that when we're talking about not necessarily diversity, but definitely when we're talking about inclusion, that we're mindful of the language. With respect to diversity, for me, it's a different language, and that language starts with a definition. Define what you mean by diversity, because what my experience has been is that the non-white people think that you're talking about them. And usually what an organization is talking about is often everybody but the non-white folks, right? And so when you come out and you look at the progress, as Bobby has said, this chronicness, you don't see spaces diverse if you're a Black person looking at the space because you're looking to see you. But from the organization standpoint, the space has become more diverse, right? Because the other part of diversity is it is not a static definition, it is dynamic. And we're seeing that diversity has gone from being very much a Black-white conversation to it's a Black, Asian, Hispanic, Latino. We're now talking about gender identity, gender, sexual orientation. Like it has expanded in ways that organizations don't define when they're talking about diversity. And then for me, the last and the one that's most dear in my heart is probably going to be the death for me is data. We really advocate for micro-analysis and that is to have folks disaggregate data on both ends. So when you do your analysis, want you to not talk about women, not talk about Blacks, right? For me, the mechanics is first to disaggregate that data by the characteristics that you think influence the outcome. And then second, to take that intersectional lens to talk about why you might see a particular outcome, right? But in order to do that, it means that you have to be mindful in the ways that you collect data. And that is going in, asking the questions that get at the characteristics that you might think influence a particular outcome. So for me, it is language around diversity and inclusion, similar to what Kendra said, but probably with a different slant. And then being mindful about data and that we need to collect data so that it can be disaggregated to get at the nuances in outcomes.
Thank you. Well, you've all certainly raised some really key themes and ones that I think we'll get to have a chance to explore in more depth over the next amount of time, which is great. So we've already really just started to dig in. And I really hear in terms of the piece on reflection and engagement, the stakeholder piece that you raised, Bobby, in terms of who the customer is, who the stakeholder is, and then certainly around language and data. And I'll just add too, I think really teasing out from a language perspective, which we also do at the Institute where I'm located at IARA, the distinct differences between diversity, inclusion, and equity and anti-racism, and being really clear, as you mentioned, Rhonda, on what we mean. And so since this conversation is really centered on anti-racism, really being clear about that, are we working to build systems and practices that are intentionally dismantling racism and centering, as you mentioned, the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the process. So I'm really interested in hearing from all of you what getting comfortable with discomfort has looked like. This is a term that Glenn Singleton has used a lot in his work on courageous conversations. And given your, current professional practices and careers, I'm really interested in, has discomfort in work on anti-racism been a sign or a symptom that this advancement is happening? So has discomfort been a sign or symptom of advancing racial equity? What has discomfort looked like? And I guess you could interpret that too, of kind of pushing the boundaries of comfort in our organizations and the kind of prior or like current manifestations of organizational culture. And maybe we'll go in reverse order. We can imagine we're on stage together. So yeah. Rhonda, Bobby, and then Kendra.
I was like, dang, you would come. Because I think that when I hear that uncomfortable conversations, my mother says that I will make a doorknob talk. So I start by saying that I'm not uncomfortable in conversations, right? My parents moved to the South when I was 7. I am petite. I didn't speak like them. So, for me, so much of my life has been uncomfortable, right? So conversations are part of it. The other part for me is I do really well in terms of meeting folks where they are, finding that common space so that you remove the discomfort. One of the things that I've been really working hard in the organizations that I'm a part of, as we're talking about, whether it's anti-racism, whether it's sexist behavior, is to remind folks not to focus on the behavior, right? So you don't call someone a racist, because that is an absolute, that's going to be a waste of your time, and it's a time suck for everyone, because the discomfort in that conversation is not going to be the person recognizing that there is something about their behavior that has caused you to call them that, but it is the ways in which we react to being called that. So I think that for me, I don't have uncomfortable conversations. I meet folks where they are, and then I do my very best to shift from their behavior to what's the mission of the organization, right? Not naming the behavior, but to simply ask, is this behavior conducive for our mission? Now, having said that, I do think that what uncomfortable conversations look like is folks shutting down, and someone has put in the chat about Trump saying, look, you're not going to do this anti-racist training. To me, that is what discomfort looks like, right? Discomfort is often a shutdown. So I think that there needs to be a shift from this notion that in order to make progress, you have to have people be uncomfortable. I do think that that there are growing pains, but growing pains don't always have to be uncomfortable. Right. And so that's how I sort of see that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with those points. And for me, and for from an organizational standpoint, that discomfort often starts with having real conversations, not superficial conversations and kind of dancing around the issue, and really challenge ourselves and our organizations to talk about what is the root cause of certain symptoms, with the root cause being, in many cases, discrimination and racist, sexist, a lot of the other isms that plague corporate America. So having some of those direct conversations that are oftentimes uncomfortable, because if we're not making ourselves uncomfortable from an organization and from a leadership standpoint, we're probably not having real conversations. And progress in this space is not always smooth. It's sometimes progress from when we're talking about from a diversity inclusion space to address some of the isms that I talked about. It sometimes comes in the form of stumbling forward. It's not an easy conversation, but the conversation is worth having. And one of the things we've been doing is equipping our leaders and our employees to have those conversations. How do you have those conversations in a productive manner? How do you have those in a way that other parties can hear you, that you can get your points across? some of the potential pitfalls around that. How do you start it? How do you end it? And in order to make that progress. So yeah, it's definitely uncomfortable. And in a role like mine, we often are challenged with both inspiring and challenging our organizations and our leaders. Now, inspiring feels good. Everybody likes to be inspired, but we have to challenge as well. And if we're not in challenging,
Bobby was speaking such words of wisdom. The system has doesn't want to hear it. I was really sitting with that, the inspiring and challenging duality. I think that's a really beautifully put. I think, Bobby, you're back on.
Okay, great, yeah. And when we're in these types of roles, and be shrinking violets in these roles, we have to be able to have some challenging conversations at times, but and hope to do that in a way that we can make progress and not damage relationships to the extent that we can't hear each other. Some type of balance in making that progress.
Absolutely, yeah, Kendra.
Yeah, when I think about this, I think about two things in particular. One is McKinsey is a culture of feedback. We thrive on feedback. It is foundational, I'd say, to how we consult with our clients and how we share and create impact with clients, but also how we think about the apprenticeship and development of our consulting colleagues in our broader community. And so that foundation, right, creates a space and some of the skill, I'd say, needed, right, to be in a place to have courageous conversations, but it doesn't sort of give you every piece of it. I like to think, I do know the work on courageous conversations. The other thing I like to think about is a topic called radical candor, right? This notion of how you, right, provide both a position of caring personally, but challenging directly in the way you engage in feedback and in discussion and conversation. And I think that's something that when I imagine this topic and how you move the ball forward has to be part of where you go. One of the things that Rhonda was talking about in terms of, does it always have to be uncomfortable, or does it always have to feel like you're in conflict in order to create advancement? And while I don't think it has to always have that, I do think there is this notion that you've got to both meet people where they are, but start with some desire for change, right? It may not be the same perspective of change. It may not be the same, goalpost or that you want to get to, but the notion of wanting to do the work to invest in some form of change is, I think, a huge part of how you get to the place of courageous conversation and difficult discussion resulting in action and outcome. One of the things that we did this year that really was opened my eyes to the opportunity that, frankly, I know we were talking about Zoom before, that Zoom created for us as a West Coast community is each year we have a Values Day experience where literally the firm closes to client service, and all around the world we spend the day invested in our values as a firm. For the West Coast office, we did something really unique this year, which is to say we want to take that time and we want to invest it in having some of these courageous conversations. We want to put the notion of how do we become an anti-racist culture on the table. We want to dive into some difficult, topics around that and what it means for us as a community. And, I think there were over 600 of our colleagues who invested, volunteer time, I would say, in saying, I'm committed, I'm engaged, I want to be part of this conversation in some way. And we were able to actually use, again, this unique environment of Zoom to very quickly move into some small group discussions to big group discussions to really change, right, the environment that we were in, to have, I think, the dialogues and the radical candor, right, that's required, right, to really think about what it means to do this kind of work. So I agree with everything that Bobby and Rhonda were saying around sort of the notion of how do you sort of use the environment and the culture that you're in to build the notion of a space for courageous conversation. And I think having some platform of commitment to feedback, having some platform of commitment to change in some direction. It's not going to always be the same. My version of what that is may not be what yours is, but if we start from a foundation of wanting that to happen, I do think it can really set the stage for something pretty impactful.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen the impact of social media and technology, both in this time and in the last 5 years or so, in both documentation of our inequitable realities. So both whether in the wake of George Floyd's murder and other police murder and violence examples this summer, and also just the opportunity through various channels for professionals, and specifically Black, Indigenous, and people of color professionals, to vocalize and document what the reality of experience has been within organizations and companies. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. I'm going to pass it back to Steve briefly right now.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to remind anyone joining our webinar in midstream that we are from day one, and we're exploring building an anti-racist culture in the business community. Our sponsors are McKinsey and Company and Achievers. As a reminder, you can submit your questions at any time, as some people already are, and that's great. And our speakers will answer as many as they can during the Q&A session. Now back to you, Erica.
Great, thanks. And I'm seeing some great questions so far, so please keep them coming. We definitely want to hear what our panelists have to say and really make this engaging. We know you all are out there. We have actually over 250 people with us right now, which is amazing. So this summer, as I mentioned, we saw both uprising and people organizing on the streets, a lot of that community-led, young people-led. We also saw a lot of organizations, and specifically companies and in the private sector, making statements in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and around racial justice. So I'd really love to hear from all of you, what's beyond these statements? And I'll pose it two ways. Both, a company has made this statement, and now what? Like, what follows, right? And, someone being more flippant might say it's easy to tweet, a statement, and then what? And also, what's behind them from a historical perspective? So when a company makes a statement, what does it mean in terms of also reckoning with where they've been and what their history of doing business in their area has looked like? So we'll start with you, Bobby, if that's all right.
Sure. And I'll go back to something I said earlier when I talked about the acute and chronic aspects of this opportunity, and statements fall in that acute aspect of it. With everything that was happening in the May June timeframe, companies needed to take a position on this, a public position, to get off the sidelines and ensure that their employees and communities knew where they stood as relates to racial justice or racial injustice, discrimination, diversity, all of those terms. So companies who may have played at the middle of the road or played it safe really needed to get out there. So that fell in the acute aspect, and people appreciated that. One of the things from our organization, not only do we make these external statements and public statements, but we encouraged internal conversations as well, in town halls, those types of things. Those fell into the acute, and people appreciated that, and people needed that, and wanted to talk about it, wanted to hear from the company. But as we know, talk is cheap and talk is not enough. So then that's when it moves over into the chronic aspect of it, and say, how long, what are we going to do about this? Because I was in another conversation with the diversity professionals, said they feel like they've been having this conversation for 3 months and 30 years. So we all know that this isn't new. And so then that's when each organization has to say, what can we do? What are our true opportunities? These areas of opportunity for our company and for the communities in which we reside, and what do we do about it? What are the areas? And I spoke about some of those others for us on how we wanted to increase it by increasing our visibility, capability, and accountability, And it has to be very tangible and intentional. Those are, again, nice sounding strategic words, but what are there specific actions under that? And for us, there are specific actions under each one of them. We wanted to make, from a visibility standpoint, for example, we wanted to make better data informed decisions. So how are we providing information and metrics and tools to really identify what's going on here from a data standpoint, not just from a feeling standpoint. That was just one of the areas of visibility. And from a capability standpoint, some of the things we're doing is additional inclusive leadership unconscious bias training, and not as a one-off training where you've been there, done that, got the t-shirt and think you're done, but to provide some initial tools and then reinforce those over time, provide some reinforcing ongoing tools. And from an accountability standpoint, some goals, setting some different goals, metrics, tying those to performance, tying those to compensation. So making it tangible. So when organizations are making progress in this space, they address all of those areas, and they're very intentional about it. They're not just again, from most companies and most individuals, or many individuals, believe in strategic and philosophical diversity and inclusion, conceptual diversity and inclusion, but you have to be very tangible and take specific actions.
Yeah, I would add to that too. First of all, one thing you said, Bobby, that resonates with me quite a bit is there are absolutely professionals of color, friends of mine, colleagues, I think, who through the course of at least the sort of early part of the summer, I'd say, definitely felt more of a here we go again feeling than a, oh my God, something new is happening, right? I think there's just this acknowledgement of, what systemic really means, even in just our own personal professional lives, not even including, right, the experiences of our parents and others. So there's a lot of history to these experiences as distinct from a single point in time, right? That just has to be acknowledged, and that doesn't take away from the importance, as Bobby noted, of calling out what has happened, of organizations and companies making statements and acknowledging the moment, but it is for many people not as new of a moment as it may have been perceived for others. But when you talk about sort of how do you distinguish between just a comment or just a statement and action, I really think, and in what I've seen in some other organizations and in our own, there's a big piece of it that's around where is the energy and action coming from, right? And is it just coming top down? Is it just coming from the marketing or communications group or what have you? Or is it also really coming from the space and the opportunity to engage within the broader collective of the organization? And do you have both of those things working together? Because I think when you do, you have the opportunity for something that can feel sustained and action-oriented and impactful. Otherwise, to your point, right, it can become something that is fleeting and a variety of slogans or what have you. So I think that notion of where is the energy, the space, for change and for engagement coming from really matters. And then you've got to look at what what the actions result in, right? You need to be able to see something. And so to Rhonda's point on transparency and data, right? I think that is really when we are all sitting here, hopefully in person, a year from now, right? Being able to reflect on the, statements of 2020 and the commitments that many organizations made. I know we as McKinsey have made a bold set of 10 actions that we care deeply about and that are both a reflection of things we are doing together as a community and a set of reflections of things that we seek to do, in the broader society. But, we have to be held to account for what we've committed to, as many other organizations out there. And so I think data, transparency, visibility, as Bobby mentioned, those are the things that are going to really, determine whether or not this is a moment in time or something that really is, bringing us to this true notion of an anti-racist culture.
So Rhonda, you saw the statements coming in at the Institute this summer. I'd love to hear what was going through your mind and also from, this angle of research and accountability.
I'm going to echo with everyone in the here we go again, but I made a very conscious decision not to write a statement. Instead, what I did was I signed on to both of my professional organizations, both the National Economics Association, which is the arm for Black economists, and the National Mathematicians, which are, National Association of Mathematicians, which are the Black mathematicians. And part of that was not to get caught up in what I felt was a wave of statements that were coming out, because what it felt like to me was not just a here we go again, but that there was so much pressure. And I don't think the pressure was just from the racial injustice that we saw, but also it was racial injustice on top of this political climate, right? Mm-hmm. That makes me wonder if Trump were not the president and folks didn't feel this enormous amount of racial tension because of him, would we have seen these statements? So I made a conscious decision not to participate in that. Now, having said that, what I have seen in my professional organization, because we're incredibly small, Weiser is a very small institution. I've got 2 employees. It's me and like 2 other people, and that's it. But in my professional organization, where I do a good deal of service in terms of economics, there's been an enormous amount of conversation in terms of diversity in economics and how Black women in particular are treated, and whether this is a welcoming space. And they have made a statement. And I have just been one where I ignore the statements, because to me, money talks, all else walks, right? And, very much to Bobby's statement, I do feel like this is a here we go again. And I'm be completely blunt. What I am more fearful of is in the event that Biden wins, is announced the winner, what are people going to do? I personally feel like there is going to be this huge exhale, because Trump will no longer be the president without folks understanding what Bobby has said, what they said, 3 months, 30 years, that independent of who has been the president of the United States. In particular, what we see more public conversation is Black folks have never been treated well, but we could lace that with Indigenous folks have never been treated well, right? And so I am less concerned about the statement, and I'm far more concerned about whether or not people are going to hold organizations accountable in the event Biden is president, right? Because I do think that folks are going to exhale and assume that all is well. Right. And so for me, I didn't participate in those statements, because for me, it was a here we go again. I want to know what you're going to do.
I mean, this question of holding organizations accountable absolutely is important. And I think to what you're saying, it goes beyond the election. Obviously, there's a lot at stake in terms of perpetuating harm for people's lived experience. And, it goes beyond just seats of office into, the boardrooms and the conference rooms that we're talking about, in addition, to community. I also want to, lift up what you've mentioned in terms of both the implications of our current reality in politics, but also COVID-19. And I think what the spring prior to this summer really amplified in terms of racial inequities in both the impact of COVID-19 and just our healthcare system. And so I think that one system being spotlit and really put on under the magnifying glass for the public to think about and look at in public media is really important, and one example.
So Erica, I want to chime in here, because what you just said about COVID is the other thing that I'm terribly concerned about, right? That again, I don't think people understand, as long as these conversations are couched from the lens of COVID, right? Whether we're talking about the disproportionate representation of Black and Hispanic women on what we think about as frontline jobs. I won't say essential workers, because there are a lot of jobs that are essential that folks are allowed to do at home. As long as we couch that in a COVID-19 framework, when COVID-19 is no longer a threat, folks are going to forget right? And so I think it is incredibly important that we don't couch that in terms of COVID-19. It is indeed the spotlight, but as long as it's framed that way, people are going to forget when it's over. And these inequalities aren't going to go away. As Kendra has said, it's systemic, it's institutional, and we have been dealing with it for 400 years. And if you're indigenous, longer than that, right? And so I think it's incredibly dangerous to talk about that in the framework of COVID-19. I think that's incredibly dangerous.
In many ways, COVID has been an amplifier, is the way I think about it, and we've been doing quite a bit of research on this point, right? It really is the notion of sort of the inequity and the black wealth gap and other things, and not alone, right? Those are things that existed long before COVID, for sure. But COVID has amplified so many of these challenges. And I think even when we are in a place where COVID, and I do believe this will happen, is contained, let's say, the impact of that amplification will still be with us. So to your point, Rhonda, when we've shifted the news cycle, right, and shifted the potential political environment, all of those things, the impact, right, that COVID has had to amplify these challenges of inequity is still going to be with it. But those things don't pivot on a dime, right? And so even more of the reason why I think this investment in the notion of what does it mean to really not just say I want a diverse environment, but I want an anti-racist environment, and I want one that is systemically, right, shifted, right, is not something that we're going to do quickly and neatly. It's going to be sustained work, chronic work, I guess, to use Bobby's point, right? So it's not just a chronic problem, but it's going to require chronic engagement. And so it has to become much more of the connective tissue of the way we engage in our organizations and frankly in our society.
Absolutely. Thank you both for really lifting that up. And I think it speaks also to your earlier point, Rhonda, on accountability. And I'd love to just really drill down more into that right now. And we'll be turning to some of the questions from the audience. What does accountability look like internally and externally? So if a company, whether your own or a partner of yours, has, whether or not they've made a statement or a commitment to change, they've perhaps started to build some sort of base, what does actually staying accountable to that work and that process look like? And again, when I say internally, I mean more in terms of the staff, perhaps board, senior level of the organization. And when I say externally, also really drawing on this point about customers, stakeholders, grantees, whatever the kind of outside base is. We can kind of have people chime in.
From an organizational standpoint, that one of the things accountability looks like is results and outcomes, not necessarily initiatives and intentions. Having key initiatives, those are great, but those are means to an end. But are you truly driving outcomes and change and impact? Also, it looks like, if we're serious, and when organizations are serious about that, visibility, as we talked about earlier, making these changes or the progress or lack thereof very visible, and then holding leaders, feet to the fire, holding them accountable for driving those outcomes. And then finally, in the area of, as we engage from an external standpoint, as we engage with other suppliers and our potential business partners, holding them accountable as well. And that is happening more across the board. As our company and others seek to do business with large companies and others seek to do business with us, those conversations are happening around, what are you doing in this space? What are your outcomes? What are your results in this space? So that's what accountability starts to look like from a corporate behavioral change standpoint.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the notion of tying diversity and inclusion and anti-racist outcomes to performance very specifically, right? That those things are actually part of the health and performance of an organization, I think is a pretty critical metric. And metrics across the board are really what matters, as we started in this conversation, right? Data is power. It is frankly an even playing field, right? Facts are facts. And so to the extent that those are linked not just to nice to haves, but actual value of performance. How well are you doing to achieve your mission? For us, it would be how well are we doing to serve our clients if we are not recognizing that diverse thinking, diverse teams, diverse collaboration, right, actually improves the outcomes that we create for clients and that we create for the development of our own colleagues, right? We have to see that as not a nice to have, but an actual material element of our performance. I think is a big indicator.
Rhonda, did you want to jump in?
You were shaking your head, Rhonda, so I felt you were going to jump in.
Was because you said the one thing that I have been arguing in econ space is that in other spaces is that so often people think diversity as I don't even say shades of brown anymore. I say hues around the table. And one of my Stephen Carter is in his book Reflections of Affirmative Action Baby, he talks about, if you've got different shades of brown around the table with the same thoughts, right? You haven't diversified. There's no real diversity there. So I appreciate, that's what I was going yes to, because I think we forget that what people think they're getting with diversity is this assumption that having different hues around the table is going to give you different lived experiences and different thoughts. And that is not a given, right? That's just not. So for me, when I think about accountability, it is all the things that we've heard people talking about. It is transparency, but it's the transparency in what was your goal? What did you say you were going to do? Tell us. And then I think, a huge part of that, and Kendra talked about, who's making the decision? Is it top down? Like, is it external pressures? I'm wondering when companies are talking about diversity and inclusion, who are they having a conversation with? Are you talking to the marginalized folks within your company? Are you talking to your marginalized customers? Like, who are you speaking to so that you get an understanding of the work that you need to get done? And then as we're talking about, uncomfortable conversations, we have to really be mindful that in order to hold folks accountable, and a lot of this goes to the research around the Black-white wealth gap, is you've got to be in a fiscal position to call folks out on their stuff, right? Because if my livelihood is dependent on my coming to Kendra and saying, hey, Kendra, y'all said X, Y, and Z, and you have fallen short. Now, if Kendra is open to that criticism and critique that they haven't done their job, then I'm good. But if she's not, I run the risk of losing my job. So I think when we're talking about this conversation about accountability and what companies need to do, there's transparency, and there has to be a mechanism in terms of all of your constituents, all of your stakeholders who can call you on your stuff without repercussions. Now, of course, I can't just storm in her office and call her a whole bunch of names in the process, but I should be able to come and have that conversation. And I don't think we're set up for accountability in that way, right? And I feel like we're seeing that so much within the Trump administration, in particular, the number of folks that we've known have sit around the table and then tell us later about conversations, right? You can't do that. Folks have to know that they can speak up about injustice in that moment to hold accountability without losing their livelihood. So for me, transparency and a mechanism for accountability that doesn't put my livelihood at risk is what's necessary, I think, internal and external.
So great.
Yeah. And I think this piece around both the individual and the system as a whole, who holds, to an earlier point, who holds the responsibility for advancing anti-racism, and certainly not just in the HR office, and also hopefully not just, one struggling mid-level manager who's just like at wit's end, who might often be, also Black, Latinx, Asian person or woman who has, been tasked with the committee on X, Y, and Z. So I think being really, clear about that, of this being an organization-wide not just responsibility, but commitment. We're going to pass it back to Steve and then dive into some of the questions.
Thanks, Erica. Yes, we've got a bunch of great questions. Thanks to all of you who are participating in the conversation on building an anti-racist culture in the business community, and to our sponsors, McKinsey and Company and Achievers. At this time, we'll be taking questions from the audience. Over to you, Erica.
Great, thanks. So there's some excellent questions. We won't have time, unfortunately, to get to all of them, but what's wonderful in our online world is we can all continue to engage and certainly continue to follow each other's work. So a few folks have lifted up this piece on company practice and also, their historical practices or even, current practices. And so there's several questions around what systems or even practices have you seen directly in your work contributing to this chronic aspect of racism and inequity? So that could be in hiring, lack of accountability in equitable compensation and pay, promotions. So that's some of the kind of internal, like very specific practices where racism or inequity are perhaps playing out. And also, how do we hold companies accountable when Black people within them have often been disempowered or silenced by these same organizations and companies?
I'll chime in first on this one. And I think that for me, again, going back to what I said at the beginning around data and language, I think those are incredibly important. I often find that, in higher education in particular, the conversation, listen to me, I said in higher education, and I'm no longer in higher education. Woo, I tell you what, being a recovering academic is hard, man. It's a struggle every day. So let me say, when I was an academic and in the space, again, thinking about econ, so much of what I see is around data. The fact that folks will not disaggregate data, and they will talk about things like, oh, the sample size is too small. So in particular, we all sort of pay attention to Pay Equity Day, right? Like comes out in March and it's a big to do. But has anyone ever noticed that everybody has a Pay Equity Day except for white women? Right? This year, there was a Pay Equity Day for Asian women. There was a Pay Equity Day for Black women, for Native American and Hispanic women who are coming later. For me, again, so much of this is around the data that you collect. And Kendra said data is power. And I am wholeheartedly with you. But sometimes we don't collect the data in a way to make it powerful, right? And so we also have to be mindful that how I collect the data. Someone put on Twitter recently that who you center shows your values. The ways in which I collect data, the ways that those questions are asked also reflect the values that I have. So, so for me, so much of this is around data. We don't have the appropriate data. And then even if we do have the data, the ways in which we will aggregate groups as if we all have similar lived experiences, right? And that's so not true, or that a particular outcome, like someone talked about the ways in which Black people may be silenced in a workspace. Well, someone could say that women are also, and I use the term women more broadly, and again, generally that is going to mean white women are also silenced. But what we know about household structure is this: if there's a Black person who is silenced in the workplace, they're probably being paid less, and they're likely not to be in a 2-earner income. For the white woman who's being silenced in the workplace, she is not likely to be a single earner. Right. And so that if she loses her job, yes, there are consequences for her family, but they're not the same consequences for the Black person who loses their jobs. So I think this notion again around data and language, you got to say what you mean, to be very deliberate in your definitions, and they need to be public. Without that, we don't have much, right? And you can't really move this conversation in a meaningful way.
And I'd like, add to say that, it's definitely everyone's responsibility in the organization to have those conversations, not just the marginalized employees or communities, because to Rhonda's point, they can be silenced, or they implement what's called protective hesitance. They want to say something, but they have seen others who maybe have spoken up on issues or pointed out issues where it didn't go well, either in the current organization or another organization or past experience. So it's everyone's definite responsibility to speak up and address those issues, not just one group or the most impacted group. One of the questions you asked initially is what areas have we seen this in? And from a corporate standpoint, we've seen it across all the different areas. I mean, if you think just from a talent standpoint, we've seen from a discrimination standpoint or a lack of diversity or bias standpoint in the attract, develop, and retain space. So we often haven't effectively attracted diverse talent in the organization by not diversifying and broadening our sources of where we get them, or where we bring from which we bring diverse talent in, or the descriptions on which the job descriptions on which we seek to bring people in under. That's a couple of issues under the track. From a develop standpoint, leaders will have said, well, I would have loved to consider diverse candidates for a particular leadership role, but there was no one there, or the pipeline was thin. And sometimes that's true, but it's because we haven't done sufficient work in developing that pipeline in the diverse development phase. And then finally, from a retention standpoint, many organizations have what we call tongue in the cheek, a hole in the bucket issue, in that even when they've done a better job of attracting diverse talent, they tend to leave at a faster rate, oftentimes because the environments and the opportunities aren't conducive to them staying and thriving. So there's no one silver bullet in our mind or one area to address. If you just fix this area, you'll be fine. It takes a more holistic approach to from an attract, develop, and retain standpoint. And again, when we're talking about talent.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Bobby, and it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. It's frankly my area of work and passion, and it is all of those things at once that must be addressed. So the whack-a-mole model, right? We're just gonna pump the front end of the funnel and not think about development, or we're just gonna make sure that these three individuals are promoted and not actually address the fact that development journey in the middle is what creates a sustained flow of diversity change, right? Is I think something that's really quite critical, and that often many organizations sort of just don't appreciate have to happen systemically and together and in a unified way, and as opposed to we get very focused on let's go out and do tons of flashy attraction and then forget about what happens when folks arrive at the front door. I think the other piece of that too, Bobby, that I would just emphasize too, is this notion of how do you think about sponsorship, right? How do you think about really changing the dynamic of what it means to be committed to developing those who don't look just like you, right? And that is something that I think within organizational cultures, the more we can sort of break the seal on and be really invested in, I think is part of that journey of moving from attraction to development and retention. It is not an uncommon thing in most societies, right? Or most environments, right? That you are drawn to what you know, right? And yet we also know that especially for Black women and other women of color, the sense of otherness that you experience in most organizations probably makes it pretty, pretty likely that notion of the sponsor who looks like you isn't going to arrive because they don't actually exist in the organization. So we've got to find ways to break that notion of sponsorship as something that is homogeneous, and rather something that really we identify on different dimensions as critical to development and retention in organizations, and something we spend a lot of time thinking about as critical to how we think about our talent. It's also a component of how you think about, again, in the notion of client service, what it means to be able to break that notion of counseling and commitment to others when they don't necessarily represent your experience.
So one of the roots for me in my own, work of defining racism has been the People's Institute of Racial Bias or Prejudice plus Power. And so I really want to touch on this notion of power, power manifesting in organizations, white people in organizations holding power. The New York Times had a big expose this summer, really going through every major industry in the US and indicating the kind of the onlys within most industries in terms of representation of Black, Indigenous, people of color, including Asian Americans, Latinx folks, and others. And so we've centered, part of our discussion on groups that are marginalized in racial identity. We haven't talked a lot about white people and those like myself and what it means to really be accountable and hold power. And that in terms of history, it's white people who have historically held positions of power in both the private sector and also, I'd argue, in nonprofits and NGOs. So there's been some questions in the chat, both about engaging white people in this work, but I'll also incorporate this theme of power, of what it really means to throw it back to your company and engage in that discourse on who holds power, who holds decision-making.
So I'll go ahead and chime in and say that something that you said struck me, and that is that you said historically white people have held power. And I would say currently white people hold power, right? This is not historic. This is, something that we're actually living right now, that this shift of power has not changed. And I'm also glad that you wrote that, because it made me think about, you asked that question because I'd written something that Kendra said about allies. And I think that as we're looking at white people who are in power positions, that it is incredibly important to explain to them, and this is not blanket, in your situation, what do you need from them as an ally, right? Because I don't think sometimes they know what it means to be an ally, that they do not understand how to utilize that power, and dare I say, for good, right? They do not understand how to help you move that agenda forward. And I think that we assume that they do without having a conversation and saying, look, this is what it means to be an ally for me. That might not be what Kendra needs, right? It might not be what she needs at McKinsey, but me, Rhonda, the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, this is what I need for you to do as my ally. What I often tell people in econ space that is always disheartening for me is I feel like so often when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, and especially helping people navigate spaces, we talk to the person who is disadvantaged about all of the hurdles that are coming along the way. But we don't talk to the allies about how to remove those hurdles. And so I like to tell people, use this football analogy. I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. And so I'm always like, just imagine, right, in the days of Franco Harris and Lynn Swann and Roger Sawar, if Franco Harris was saying to Lynn Swann, hey, look, here comes the safety, as opposed to blocking. Right? We need our allies to block. We don't need you to tell me what your colleagues are going to be averse to. We need you to do the work. And that's I know that's blanket, but I think an important part of it is to educate our allies about their powers and the best way to use that for our benefit. And that's not blanket.
Just to pick up on that, and when we started, and I mentioned this notion that having knowledge is one of the most important parts of beginning a lot of this work, right? One really important piece of information that many people don't appreciate is, racism is really about power. We often misdefine racism as a cruel act, right? Or someone was mean to someone as an individual dynamic. But really it's a power structure. And so you're just understanding that alone. That's a lot for many people to take in. It's not how most people were educated, right? It's not really, if you think about the way in which we flippantly discuss or see it on social media, or someone's being racist, it's yelled out in this very individual way. But and I know I'm preaching to the choir, Erica, in the work that you're doing, but that's not actually what racism is. And so you have to really just start by being able to educate and be knowledgeable about that before you can even then move into what Rhonda's talking about, which is to how to be an ally, how to really play a position that is, about shifting the power dynamic, not just your individual action. And that's a very different way of thinking than everything we do, right? We teach people about, being an independent thinker and your individual contribution and all of these sorts of things. So when you imagine, like, you're now saying, actually, if you really want to do something about racism, you've got to think about the system that you're in and the system that you're a part of and the system that creates power for you. And that is just, again, it's a heavy thought. So there's a lot about this work that is not, okay, just do your, just show up at this one meeting, or don't say this one phrase, or, and that, that's the chronic nature of this. And that's, when if I'm talking to white friends and white allies, right, who want to engage, part of it I really push is just make sure that you are knowledgeable about what we're talking about. It is not just joining a book club or being, kind to me, as much as I appreciate it. Right, it is actually a much bigger responsibility that you have to change.
One of the things, and I definitely agree with all the comments that have ever been said, but when we talked about earlier, defining what we're talking about, when we talk about diversity in organizations, we mean difference. That's the general term of diversity, meaning difference. So we can talk about it in this general macro term, and that includes, again, white people as well, and white males or whatever else who think that we're not talking about them when we say diversity. There's no gender or race or ethnicity that has a monopoly on diversity. It truly means difference. Now, again, when we're addressing specific issues, it's important to define that, as Rhonda mentioned earlier, define specifically what we're talking about when we're trying to narrow down and address an issue as well. So defining a specific group that we're trying to target or we need to enhance. So that's important. So the broad term includes everyone, including white people as well. Around the issue of ally, I think it's, as has been said here, it's very important to be an ally, to seek allies, to have conversation with allies, and have those conversations in a way that that doesn't distance imperfect allies. And allies have to be willing to show up and support with their imperfection. So imperfect allies are very important, because if you distance imperfect allies, they feel like, okay, they've touched the hot stove, it didn't work, so now they're not going to go there again. So if you're an opportunity or have a chance to be an ally, realize that you can come up and show up and support with your imperfections and learn to grow. And others, again, in a marginalized group, don't distance those imperfect allies. Take an opportunity to help them grow.
Yeah. Well, this is the point on meeting people where they are, right? That notion of bringing empathy to the discourse. If everyone is expected to get it all right, we might as well pack up and go home, right? Because it's just not going to work out that way. So I fully agree. You've got the notion of being an ally who comes with I consider myself an ally of many other groups of colleagues and communities that I am not a part of. And I am not, I'm coming with meaningful imperfection but a desire, right, for that fundamental opportunity to help change and shift.
And I really like that term, the perfect allies, and not to shut people away, because I think that what comes along with that is that there's work that we have to do to be willing to educate the imperfect allies, and not always assume that every ignorance that someone shows up, or let me take that back, every imperfection that someone shows up is laced with malice, right? And to recognize that for most of us, what we know is familiar, right? We know things based on how we were educated, the spaces that we grew up in. And when someone doesn't have that knowledge, to be willing to provide some education to them. And then the other thing that Bobby said that I want to remind us is that as we talk about diversity, and he said, diversity hinging, is on difference, we also have to be mindful that that diversity that difference has always been used to exclude. And so we want to be very careful, right, that while diversity is what we're using, difference is what we're using to include folks, that we're not using that same difference to actually exclude folks, because that's what it has done historically. Right. And so that difference is a tricky one that I think if you're not consciously thinking about the difference, you can have a situation of exclusion and not inclusion.
Yeah. And there's a saying that says diversity without inclusion equals frustration. And by the way, and inclusion isn't toleration, by the way, so there's very few personal or professional relationships where people are they're happy that their difference is being tolerated, so it's really that difference is being encouraged and valued in the workplace.
Yeah. And I want to say just one more thing on this notion of inclusion that I saw as I was interviewing for D&I jobs before I left the academy. And that is often when we're talking about inclusion, that is not a conversation that is inclusive of white men. That what I find quite often when people are talking about inclusion, they are basically saying white men be quiet and let everyone else speak. And I think it's important that if we're really mean inclusion, that it has to be a space for everyone's voice and not just a space for the voices that we have seen to be marginalized. That's not creating an inclusive space. Right. And so I think that's incredibly important that we talk about that. And at the end of the day, and many of the issues that we're talking about in terms of anti-racist behavior and power, it is white males who hold a significant amount of power. So if we don't have spaces where their voices are heard, there'll be a whole lot of things still being done, not to our benefit. And we'll be wondering why. It's because, he wasn't part of that conversation so that we'd have some idea about what he was thinking.
Yeah.
And the outcome is not richer, right? If we go back to where we started, right? We know that the outcome is richer from the diversity and from the inclusion of ideas, thoughts, right? And people. And so any form of exclusion, right, is diluting that opportunity. So I love your notion of it. Thank you.
Well, I hope people are listening because the insights have been really incredible from all of you, especially on this point around imperfection, holding imperfection, showing up, continuing to show up, even when it gets, whether uncomfortable, tough, or hard, and recognizing that, as Rhonda pointed out, the historical and current reality for people who are oppressed in institutions is that it's frustrating and hard. And also what you spoke to, Kendra, of really acknowledging the different dimensions of racism and really beyond what, especially in the education system, we were taught that racism was, and not to mention, from media and other forms of our society. We have time for one or two last questions. Speaking of those other dimensions of society, I'd love to hear how you all are thinking about this work in relationship to other sectors and industries. So we've had some questions in the chat around media, specifically a specific TV show, but I would broaden it to just thinking about how your work with businesses and in the private sector is in whether conversation or in partnership with the media, and I'd also throw in education. There was a question about business school students. So obviously the kind of next generation of professional leaders, and also, higher education and academic spaces. So you could kind of think about, beyond the business sector, how are you looking to do this work or to learn from examples of this work being done well in, the education sphere, media, et cetera. And when I say this work, I mean, advancing anti-racist practice.
I'll start. One thing that's really interesting to me, I've actually had 2 careers at McKinsey. I started as a consultant 20 years ago, which coming out of the Kennedy School, actually, Erica, and then left the firm for a while and came back. And I remember when I joined as a consultant, we were the kind of firm that thought we, would never be in the media, if you will. And I even remember going to my first McKinsey office, and there was nothing on the building to even say that McKinsey was in the building. I was thinking that I was in the wrong place because I had no idea that the firm was there. So that's sort of how discreet we were. And I think, over the course of these 20 years and the kind of society that we have and social media and all of the just explosion of access to information, we have become an organization that appreciates, right, how we need to be part of the conversation. We are part of a broader discussion. And I think the work we are doing and continuing to do in the research space, in impact in areas from education to, I mentioned the notion of the wealth cap, and we just released a really incredible report on Black lives and livelihood. And then, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, our annual piece on women in the workplace was released, and actually did quite a bit of work this year on really looking at women, not as a monolithic group, but Black women, Latinx women, Asian women, recognizing that all of those experiences are different. But I think, when you ask the question of how do we think about media, I think we have to be part of the discussion, right? We have to be part of using information, data, transparency to engage, right? Through media, through sources of ways of touching different parts of society and culture. I don't think, the idea that somehow media is I don't want to say something political, but, fake news, or this notion that somehow the media is something we can't see as part of our society and our culture, when it is so, I can't get the phone out of my kids' hands, that, they are learning things through access to social media faster than I can, engage them at the dinner table. So, both personally and I think professionally, we have to recognize that it is a tool for engagement. It is a tool for the way in which we connect with one another. And I think to sort of suggest anything else is to really miss the opportunity, I think, for what it can do when we are, grounded in real information. And so that's why I was, raising the research pieces, because I think it helps to create the fact base, right, for discourse.
I think as organizations, when we have to take opportunities to use our platforms and to influence our platforms and opportunities to help raise awareness around where are the challenges, where are the opportunities, and then to engage with those groups to do something about it. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, for our organization and many others, one of the key pillars that we engage is marketplace, and that marketplace includes the communities in which we engage, our external relations, and including media. And on those platforms, how are we influencing? Like if we're going to be asked as a large organization to be involved in some type of speaking engagement and platforms, are we encouraging that organization to ensure that they have diversity there? And for us, are we engaging with the various school systems to educate people earlier on in the process, not waiting until they get to even college or professional year? Are we moving down that pipeline to help educate in those earlier arenas and environments? And so those are some of the things. And then from a community, doing the same thing from a community standpoint, are we investing in those communities to help raise awareness in which we do business? Not only investing in funds, which are very important, but investing in our presence, establishing a presence in those as well.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy to hear Bobby say, and in terms of your presence, this is my second, I think, I was on one that was anti-Black, sponsored by the Economic Policy Institute. And when I was talking about data, Jariper Hill, who is out of Mississippi, a labor organization out of Mississippi, made the comment that data is not a democracy, right? And that that the folks who hold the data are not coming back to the community and engaging the folks who need the data to actually do the work. And so when you talk about the media, I got a love-hate relationship with them, because I often feel like so much of the isms they perpetuate. And, you know, I'm real clear. It is a great time to be a Black economist right now. Everybody wants to chat with us, but they only seem to chat with us around Black issues, right? And I think that not just with the media, but I would say this is also a diversity and inclusion notion, is that it is far more important to know what people's expertise, what your expertise is, and not what your race expertise is per se, right? So don't come to me because I am a Black woman. Come to me because I do the work that you need an expertise on. And I'm not, the media hasn't treated us in that way, right? I think they've like, it's a Black issue, talk to a Black economist. No, we all have the same level, same first year of training, right? No matter where you go, we all take the same classes, so we can all talk about several things across the board. Then I think the second thing in terms of education, I wholeheartedly agree with Bobby, and I think we really forget this, that so much of what we see in broader spaces, you can identify many of those habits from where people were educated, because that is a climate, as I'm telling my students right now, as I'm teaching statistics, this is where you begin to prepare folks for real life. And so if there is, I would say if there's bad behavior, I often think you can trace it back to undergrad and graduate school in terms of the ways in which we engage folks, the ways in which we encourage our students to ask questions, the ways in which we allow their peers to respond to them when they make comments in spaces. And so when we're talking about having folks come in the space and being comfortable, the number of students across the board who will not ask a question because they are terrified of having the wrong answer, and the effort that you have to put in to make that environment positive so that they can ask a question. I can tell you as a faculty member, full-time and part-time is incredibly draining. Yet I will also say it is incredibly rewarding to see students give wrong answers, and and it's not under their breath, because you can't do that in my class, right? But that is incredibly rewarding. So for me, I think the trick is, how do you use the media to get the good that you're doing out, right? Because I think we do forget that they will be on you when you do bad, right? They will be there looking bad. So how do we actually use them to talk about the good, right? It would have been really great to have someone from the media be a part of this conversation, right? To see the breadth of folks who are here, as well as the participants to talk about this. So this isn't just McKinsey writing the report, but this is McKinsey participating in a webinar in which people can get continuing education credits, right? Like, who does that, right? Where is the media to represent that, especially in this political climate, right? So love-hate relationship with them.
Well, the conversation certainly continues. As you pointed out, Rhonda, there's lots more to do. There's lots more to speak about. This has certainly just been one chunk, but we've really heard some wonderful perspectives and insights from all of you. I'm really grateful for this conversation. I wanted to leave us with the actual first part of Dr. King's quote, which is, "What always bothers me is that the long, hot summer has always been preceded by a long, cold winter. And the great problem is that the nation has not used its winters creatively enough to develop the program, to develop the kind of massive acts of concern that will bring about a solution to the problem." And I'll just remind, everyone who's engaged with us today and who are engaged in this work, we're entering into a new season, and that in which this continues. So I really join everyone virtually in thanking the three incredible panelists, Kendra, Bobby, and Rhonda, who've shared their insights with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. Your quotes were a great way to bookend the conversation. Thanks to our wonderful speakers, Kendra, Rhonda, and Bobby. It was a great conversation. A lot has been said on this topic lately, but you brought all kinds of new insight. I especially appreciated your exchange about imperfect allyship. That was very good. We're all a little imperfect. Thank you again to McKinsey and Company and Achievers, and to all of you for participating today. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and check out more of our upcoming webinars. I'll tick off a few here. Thursday, November 5th, the future of remote work, gauging long-term impact on engagement and performance. Thursday, November 12th, improving communication and engagement in a remote workforce. And Tuesday, November 17th, we'll be doing our 4th full-scale virtual conference with panel discussions, workshops, and networking. The focus is on supporting families, how employers can help workers in challenging times. Visit our website at fromday1.co to learn more. Thanks, everyone. Stay well.